Hello, this is Garrett Ashley Mullet, and I'd like to welcome you to the Garrett Ashley Mullet Show here on YouTube, or wherever it is that you're watching this. Thank you for joining me today. It is Saturday afternoon here in Greeley, Colorado, and I want to talk with you about public discourse. Now, it is the, first Saturday of June 2020, and I have spent a great deal of my free time this past week discussing Black Lives Matter. And I want to note that there are some people who genuinely want to have an honest discussion. So far, I have not found any of them who are supporters of Black Lives Matter, at least at the outset. Now, there have been a couple of exceptions once they were called out for cheap tricks and low blows and personal attacks and insinuations, and that seems to have made a difference. But far more often, I have encountered people who have decided they're going to support Black Lives Matter. They don't want to hear any questions about it. They don't want to hear any disagreement about it. And if you try to offer questions or assertions to the contrary, you're a racist, and they have no obligation to talk to you, no obligation to treat you with respect, no obligation to extend any courtesy whatsoever to you or your position. They haven't heard your position. They don't know what it is, but they know that they hate it. They know that it's evil. They know that it's wrong. They know that you're ignorant. And that's the end of the discussion with those people. And if you persist past the point where they've decided they're done with it, they're going to hurl abuse on you. Now, this reminds me of something that Jesus says in the New Testament. He says, "Don't cast your pearls before swine. They'll trample on the pearls, and then they will turn and tear you to pieces. You don't give to dogs what is holy." And there are people who very much, in their way of thinking about life and their way of approaching decisions and their way of critically examining things that are presented to them or not, are very much pig-minded, pig-headed. They think with their stomach. They feel with their stomach. They don't really think. They feel more than thinking. I'm reminded of a Thomas Sowell quote, which says, "The problem isn't that Johnny can't read. The problem isn't even that Johnny can't think. The problem is that Johnny doesn't know what thinking is. He confuses it with feeling." And Thomas Sowell is exactly right. We have so many young people who have been processed by an education system which does not teach them to think critically. It doesn't equip them to think critically. It brainwashes them. It gives them such a barrage of facts without context, without correct interpretation, and without the framework within which to interpret those facts for themselves. And then when they grow up and they become part of the voting populace and they are listening to current events via the news, they think that they are informing their opinions with little 30-second sound bites and little tweets from their favorite celebrities all day, every day. And if you hear this 30-second clip and that 30-second clip and that 30-second clip, and a dozen of your favorite celebrities are all tweeting the same 130 characters, 110 characters or less opinion, then you've got a good idea of what's going on. That's just not correct. That's just not a healthy way to cultivate the mind. It's not a healthy way to operate. It's not a healthy way to inform yourself. And yet so many young people in America, they are told, this is what you're supposed to think. This is what you're supposed to believe. And as soon as that changes, when it changes very dramatically, very quickly, it's disruptive. It is uncomfortable, and it's disorienting. And what a lot of us feel when this happens is we feel the ground shifting beneath our feet. But what that should tell us, what we should come away from that concluding, is that we should not have been standing there to begin with. If that ground was loose all along, then we shouldn't just go right back to the same spot once this present feeling of discomfort goes away. And we shouldn't just say, well, the whole earth is just collapsing in on itself because this over here was a mudslide, right? Jesus also in the New Testament talks about whoever hears his words and abides by them is like a wise man that built his house on the rock, and the winds and the rains came and they beat against that house, but the house stood fast because it was built on the rock. It was built on solid, substantial, strong foundations. By contrast, anybody that hears Jesus' words and they ignore them and they dismiss them and they just cast them off like they are ridiculous and foolish and not applicable is like a foolish man who builds his house on the sand. And when the waves come rolling in, and when the rain starts pouring heavily and the wind starts blowing really strong, that house falls in on itself because it is built on a shaky foundation. Now, when you're in good weather and the house seems to be just fine, right? It's a nice house. It was easy to put up. It was easy to set it on its foundation. The foundation was easy to work with. That should not be taken as a sign that when troubles come, you're going to be in good shape. So that said, we have, according to Entertaining Ourselves to Death, this wonderful little book. It's a few decades old. I just recently listened to it on the recommendation of my wife's cousin's husband. The author presents a really interesting history of the United States of America in particular. And one of the claims that he makes is that early colonial America on through the 19th century was very literate. We were a very literate people. There were a lot of printing presses here. There were a lot of books that were published here. There were a lot of people who were interested in finding out what Enlightenment thinkers were putting out there, what was going on back in Europe. They were interested in reading the Bible, but not just the Bible. They were interested in educating themselves on political philosophy, on history, government, religion, economy. You know, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, talking about the importance of merchants being unconstrained to make decisions that were in their individual self-interests. Thomas Paine and others writing about the reason for government, the purpose of government being to preserve and protect the liberty of its citizens. You think about the ideas that came out of the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment period with regards to freedom of religion. You know, there were all of these destructive conflicts, wars of religion between Protestants and Catholics, between various kinds of Protestant denominations. And there were a lot of writings which, depending on where you were in Europe, you could not get a hold of them. You would be in major political trouble for owning them because the church and the state were so inseparable. So if your church was Anglican, if your church was Presbyterian, if your church was Reformed, if your church was Catholic or Lutheran or whatever, and you owned the wrong books from some other denomination or some other Christian sect, or from somebody who was an atheist or who was not religious at all, they were anti-religious, you could get in very real trouble in a hurry. But in America, the idea early on was, let's expose ourselves to all of these ideas and let's cultivate the ability to think critically about what is true and what isn't true. And let us preserve our own liberty by enshrining it in our governing principles, in our Constitution. Let's preserve our freedom and one another's freedom to discuss these things freely, to talk about what is the nature of right and wrong, what is the nature of reality, why are we here, how should we live, how should we organize ourselves, how should we relate to one another. And what that means in practical terms is that people were free to be mistaken, right? You cannot give people freedom, but only if they're going to make the right decisions with it. You can't give them freedom of speech, except for when they're going to use freedom of speech to say something that you don't like. In that case, they don't have freedom of speech. You know, if you only give people freedom to act when they're going to make what you feel are good decisions, then that's no freedom at all, right? So the idea that people were free to discuss how to organize themselves together, how to worship God, how to live their lives, how to do business, how to form government and participate in the job of governing this nation, this new nation that had been founded on these revolutionary ideas. What that meant in practical terms was that people were going to make mistakes. They were going to get it wrong. And giving states individual rights and freedom to organize themselves along certain lines, agreeing on a loose framework of this is what we will work together on, this is our common purpose for being a United States of America, for being a united people. That loose framework contained a patchwork of different ideas as far as, should we be like the Puritans and say, liberty is societal. Your community, in order to have liberty, must constrain individual members and not allow them to do things that are going to corrupt or negatively impact the morals of the village, the town, the city, whatever. Was it going to be like New York, which beforehand had been New Amsterdam, which had been a Dutch trading post, where the Dutch had learned that it was counterproductive to doing business if you were always going to be hung up on whether your trading partner was of a different religion than you were. If you were going to trade with Muslims or Hindus or moon worshippers or animistic Native Americans or whatever, they learned early on you are better served to just put the religious differences aside for a moment and focus on, I will trade you this for that. So New Amsterdam was very open-minded, very tolerant of Jews and Indian tribes that would come there to trade or to do business. And nowadays we have New York City, which reflects that early on foundation being set. In the southern states, where it was in vogue to enslave people, to put them to work to pick cotton or to plant and grow and harvest crops or to do any kind of manual labor, it became a real problem by the middle of the 19th century for the nation to tolerate slavery as an institution. It didn't start out with blacks being imported en masse to be slave labor, but blacks in Africa enslaved one another and sold one another to Arab traders, who then sold their cargo, their wares of human chattel to Portuguese and others, who then took them across the Atlantic to North America, where they were put to work. And initially, the slaves were Irish. And what was so easy for the early colonists from England and Scotland, who had prejudice against the Irish, what was so easy was thinking of the Irish as less than human already, then treating them like they were cattle, treating them, and then subsequently blacks, as if they were cattle, as if they were just a type of sophisticated oxen or horse, something to do work and eat its food and sleep in this little ramshackle over here and know its place. And so there was freedom early on, even though not all of the states and not all of the founding fathers wholeheartedly agreed with all of the ideas that were being lived out. The principle of liberty to do the right thing necessarily meant freedom to do the wrong thing. And at a certain point in our history, it became intolerable to permit a certain wrong to continue on. And so there was a civil war. There was the election of Abraham Lincoln, who the southern states recognized because he was Republican, because the Republican Party was founded in that era on abolishing slavery, They knew his election meant that their days of owning slaves in the South were numbered. And so they secede very early on in his presidency. And that's his first test. He comes in right out the gate being tested by the South, by these secessionists who formed the Confederacy. And what's remarkable to me is we, as a nation, as a country, the United States of America, lost 250,000 people during the Civil War to decide, yes, states' rights, but more specifically, states' rights with regards to slavery. It can be true that all eagles are birds without all birds being eagles. It is true that the Civil War was about states' rights, but more to the point, it was about slavery. It was fought over the question of slavery first and foremost. And the fact that 250,000 Americans died fighting with brother to brother and father to son and cousins against one another and friends who had served previous to the Civil War at each other's throats and murdering one another in close combat, in bloody, vicious close combat, that 250,000 Americans having died to resolve that question is glossed over very quickly in discussions of America's original sin of slavery, original sin of racism. As some authors I've read have pointed out, the remarkable thing about America is not that we had slaves. All human societies at some point or another, or throughout their history, have had some form of slavery. What's remarkable is that Great Britain and the United States of America, pressed by white abolitionists more than anything, white abolitionist Christians more than anything, said, this is wrong, we're putting a stop to it. And not only did they put a stop to it, they expended a great deal of blood and treasure to do so. They exerted a lot of political capital, expended a great deal of political capital to do so. And yet, those who campaign against the tradition of the United States of America being in any way a moral authority or a shining city on the hill, as Ronald Reagan was famous of saying, they point to slavery in a very selective way, cherry picking what facts from our history are relevant based on what's convenient to their narrative. The narrative is a foregone conclusion, and the facts need only be convenient. But as I just recently experienced within the past 2 weeks, discussing these things with friends from high school, from college, family members, bringing up the Civil War and saying that was decided 150 years ago is flippant. If you say, but wait a second, the Emancipation Proclamation happened, right? You can't skip over that part and forget that that was a real occurrence. There was change. If we don't define the problem correctly, we're not going to define the solutions properly. And so, because Black Lives Matter to me, correctly defining the problem and the solutions is important. And if it's not permissible to disagree about what the problem and the solutions are, why is that? Usually when someone is very sensitive about being disagreed with, that suggests to me that they don't have very good arguments and that they may also have ulterior motives. Now, someone can say in response to that, no. There are other reasons why somebody might be defensive, why someone might not want to hear any kind of disagreement. And those reasons have to do with highly emotional investments that Americans have, whether they're black or white, whether they are the people who feel like they've been oppressed, or they are the allies of friends and family who have told them all of these stories over the years about being oppressed, and they don't want to be seen as unsympathetic. There's a lot of emotion involved, and there's a lot of emotion invested in whether or not we're going to be a racist country, whether or not you're going to permit somebody else to be oppressed and mistreated because of their race, whether or not you're going to permit me, if I'm a racist, to get away with having racist attitudes, whether you're going to permit me to benefit from having racist attitudes, whether you're going to permit me to be prosperous. Because if I have racist, ugly attitudes and I am successful, then who knows? Maybe people are going to look up to that, and who knows where it stops, right? So there's reasons why I think subconsciously people go down this trail where they think that if you are going to shout down racists or alleged racists, that is the most virtuous way you can protect your people of color in America who are complaining of systemic bias, systemic racism against them. But there's another angle to look at it from, and that is a black man gets pulled over by the cops and you assume that it was because he was black. It's a fact that he was pulled over by the cops. It's not necessarily a fact that he was pulled over for being black. He might have been pulled over just as quickly if he had been a white person. Is the framework within which you put the facts and then interpret them and then connect the dots. Is it true? If I begin asking that question and examining the stories that you're telling me of oppression, usually from 50 or 150 years ago, because it's more difficult to find stories in the present day, once you've invested yourself to a certain point, it can become very, very uncomfortable to imagine that you have misspent your time and energy. And all the people that you cut out of your life because they disagreed with you, all of the relationships that were destroyed because you were so angry with others for not seeing your point of view and not taking your side in this and not coming alongside the black community, supposedly, all of that is for naught if you were mistaken all along. And if I am making a compelling argument, if somebody else among your friends and family is making a compelling argument for why this is not the right way to interpret reality, why this is not true objectively, what it is that you believe about America, what it is you believe about your neighbor, black or white or any other color, that can be very scary for a lot of people who have invested heavily. Now, this past week, I saw firsthand ugly treatment towards me and towards another friend from friends and family, people that we have known for years. So these are not complete strangers. These are people that I have known for now half of my life. Or in the case of one, I've known my entire life. I've known his entire life. Very ugly treatment. It got very, very heated very quickly. And there were a lot of accusations bandied about being insensitive to black people, about being ignorant, about not understanding, not caring, not sympathizing, about marginalizing, about downplaying, about being unhelpful at the least. But really also about not having any right to an opinion on this. And, I'm blown away at a video that I watched just the other day. It was on Breitbart. And it was a woman who had moved to America from Africa. She's got very much a thick African accent. English is not her first language, you can tell. She's got a master's degree in health services. She's going to go work for the federal government. And she goes out on this Washington, D.C. street, and she confronts Black Lives Matter. And she asks them, why are you not in Chicago? If Black Lives Matter, why are you not in the black neighborhoods where 80 to 90% of the murder victims every year are being killed by other black people? Why are you racists pushing this narrative that white people are just murdering black people left and right? Why are you pushing this narrative that cops are the existential threat to black people in America? Why? You're not oppressed. They're not oppressed. I'm not oppressed. I'm black. I'm not oppressed. And as she goes out there, and it's amazing to me, I saw one person who was clearly also a person of color, a black person, who was a Black Lives Matter protester, shouting back at this girl, telling her to go home and to shut up. And the rest of the people who were getting in her face and getting in a shouting match with her were all white. And it's like, okay, how is it that she is not possessing a valid perspective on this as a black person in America, and some angry white young person thinks that they have a better idea of black oppression, and they're going to tell a black person in America, no, you are oppressed and you need me to save you. You need me. How does that work when so many of these discussions, when it's a white person questioning the Black Lives Matter, systemic racism, social justice narrative, so many of those discussions devolve into, how dare you, as a privileged white person, have an opinion on this and dare to speak it? How dare you? You need to check your white privilege. You don't know what black people have gone through. You don't know what people of color have experienced. I do. And usually in my experience, it's a white person lecturing a white person about checking your white privilege, because they have counted up all of their black friends and all of your black friends, and they have more, and so therefore they win. And you don't even have to have an intelligent discussion. That's not the way that it works. That's not the way that you come to an intelligent solution to the problem. That's not the way that you correctly define the problem itself. But if the problem is being protected from analysis, from critical thinking, it suggests to me that the reasons for the problem being pushed to the fore are ulterior. The motives are not pure. This is not primarily about saving black people from white America. That is a front. That is a tactic that, if you read Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, you can see him bragging about as highly effective to activate minority communities to push for Marxism in America. Read Rules for Radicals, where he talks about going and befriending Roman Catholic priests and not coming right out the gate to say, you need to be approaching your bishop and your parish needs to be pushing for abortion and contraceptive rights and freedom. You don't come right out the gate and do that. You make friends. You gradually earn their trust. You work your way into their confidence. And then you push for incremental little things so that by the time the people know what's up, that this is really about you trying to get abortion legislation passed, there will be so many people within that community of faith who have your side, have your back. You'll get what you want pushed through. He talks about going into minority ethnic communities in America and trying to convince the community that they are not getting everything that they have coming to them from the standpoint of benefits, from the standpoint of privileges, from the standpoint of handouts or welfare or perks or protection, or going and saying, this is unfair, that you guys aren't allowed to do this, that's just not right. And when he says openly, Alinsky says, you create an issue, you polarize it. In other words, you figure out you're either with me or you're against me, and how to communicate that to the community, and then you freeze it. And you freeze it because you don't want people getting out of the trap. Once they're in it, you don't want them getting back out again of the trap that you've caught them in. You baited it with jealousy, with envy, with greed, with resentment. And he says too, he says, the whole community rarely to never buys what you're selling. But if half of them do, and then you put yourself forward as the person who's going to represent their cause to the powers that be, guess what? You've just created your own little army that can help you accomplish other things. And so long as you can go as their representative and say, oh, they want this, this, and this, you can get anything you want. If they're angry and you get them to display that anger and intimidate public officials, into either going along with it or backing off and not opposing it, then it's just a matter of time. He says also, Alinsky says, you don't go and ask for everything all at once. You don't say, I want the moon. You say, I just want this little piece of rock. And then when they give you that piece of rock, you want a bigger rock. What do you mean this piece of rock? That's not what we agreed on. I want a bigger rock. Give me a bigger one, and bigger one, and bigger, and bigger, 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 bigger. And after a while, you have the moon because you just kept coming back. It's the classic principle of if you give a mouse a cookie, he's going to ask for a glass of milk. That's exactly what Saul Alinsky advocated. He was a big-time proponent of Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince, and he asks the question at one point, do the ends justify the means? And he says, no, that's the wrong question. The question is, what ends? Depending on the ends, any means are justified. So then what we have, going back to the Black Lives Matter conversation, for instance, for just one of many examples in modern American society, if you say to the Americans who have taken your side on this polarized issue, whether it's really an issue or it's not an issue as you've stated it, as you've presented it, you tell them what's at stake is black people being exterminated. If we don't riot and loot and protest and organize and vote Donald Trump out of office, or shout conservatives down and bully them and terrorize them and get them banned and deplatformed and get their content removed from social media and get them blackballed from jobs in the media, get their books banned, get their content erased, canceled. If we don't do that, it's all over. Black people are going to be back in chains. They're going to be in slavery. If you really love black people, you got to be all in for all this stuff. A pastor friend of mine, he posted about Black Lives Matter, and he was very gracious about it. He was very measured. He was very humble about it. But he said, listen, guys, I see a lot of Christians using the Black Lives Matter hashtag and talking about Black Lives Matter and standing with the movement and the cause in solidarity. And I am concerned, after having done some research on Black Lives Matter and looking at their website and their About Me section, that they take a number of positions which, for the Christian, are just not acceptable. We cannot identify ourselves with this movement. We cannot identify the Christian message and the gospel and God's word with this movement. They are diametrically opposed. They are absolutely at odds with each other. And so, yes, we should treat our neighbor with respect. Yes, we should consider whether we are loving our neighbor as we love ourselves, regardless of their skin color. But we should not be using the Black Lives Matter hashtag. We should not be marching with Black Lives Matter. We should not be supporting Black Lives Matter as a organization or defending it. And the comments they ran the gamut, and they were everything from belittling him and his family and his church and the fact that he was even wanting to call himself a Christian, saying that he was a fake Christian, that he was a hypocrite, that he hates black people, that he's a racist, that he's a homophobe, that he is trying to speak for all Christians, but how dare he? To, well, that's just not the conversation that we should be having, and no, you don't need to agree with 100% of the movement in order for it to be valid, and I just think this is really unhelpful. And various tones of indignation, from cursing at him and how dare he, and just ripping him a new one publicly, to the soft, kind, gentle velvet glove of grandmother saying, you'd better not do that again. But the threat being implied nevertheless. And everybody in public seeing that, seeing the shaming, the scolding, the wagging of the finger. And it was ridiculous. I found myself wondering, why is it that in this country, even a riot in every major city in this country is defended as somehow being free speech. Businesses being burned to the ground, all of their windows smashed, people being beaten nearly to death, or being killed trying to defend stores and businesses from being pillaged. That is defended as free speech. But a meek and mild pastor in Colorado saying, this does not agree with what I read in the Bible, and as a pastor, I'm going to encourage my church to not support this. Oh, whoa, 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 whoa. How dare you? How dare you? There's clearly a double standard here. The double standard is that it is not okay, it is not acceptable to be a conservative in America, whether you're black or white, whether you are gay or straight, whether you are non-religious or you're a Christian. The double standard is it is not okay to disagree with the left's talking points. And if you are a white person and you're protesting during this whole COVID-19 lockdown, the economy being shut down, people being unable to pay their rent and mortgage, if you're protesting that, you're putting all of society in jeopardy. But if you are Antifa and you are Black Lives Matter and you are burning things down and you are beating people in the streets and you're shooting cops and you're threatening the White House, and the President of the United States is having to go down into a bunker, and 50 to 60 members of the Secret Service are having injuries because they're trying to keep protesters, peaceful protesters, from scaling the fence of the White House. That is just people exercising their free speech, their First Amendment rights. If you are a black American and you are talking about killing cops and coming to the suburbs and tearing down a business, that is just black anger, and we need to accept it. We need to understand it. We need to embrace it. We need to bend the knee, literally get on our knees and beg for forgiveness as a country. But if it is a black conservative saying that George Floyd was no hero, he was a criminal for a long time, for 20 plus years, that he held a gun to a pregnant woman's belly while his buddies, rummaged through her apartment or her house looking for money and drugs. If you're a black conservative, then you are part of the problem. Joe Biden gets on the radio and he apologized, but it wasn't really an apology. It was a token, I got my hand caught in the cookie jar. I said a little more than I should have. But he went on the radio just a couple of weeks ago and said, if you can't figure out the difference between whether you should vote for me or you should vote for Donald Trump, then you ain't black. That's okay. But if you are a white person saying, wait a second, the Democratic Party and the left and these social justice warriors are actually keeping the black American community back from progressing. They're actually getting in the way of racial reconciliation. They're actually making things worse. They're actually promoting animus and bitterness towards one another on the part of Americans, dividing us against one another for political purposes. If you say that, then you are out of your mind. You're the one who's ignorant. And that was what I was told. That was what I was told this past week. I was told that I didn't have enough black friends, which was a presumption. It was an assumption. And you know what they say about assumptions when you assume. I was told I didn't have enough black friends. I was told that you can't learn everything in a book. So anytime I would reference a book, or I would reference statistics, well, the statistics, they're not reliable, or they don't mean what you think that they mean. The black conservatives that you've listened to who grew up in the black community, they don't really know what they're talking about. They're just telling white people what they want to hear. The books that I've read on history, they don't count unless they were written by black Americans who hold whatever is supposed to be the majority black American opinion on these things. Anything that you are going to say will be dismissed. You are just upholding the status quo, and you are defending systemic racism. If not, that you yourself are racist. You don't care about black people. You don't care that they're being mistreated. You don't care that they're being prevented from getting good jobs and getting a good education and living in safe neighborhoods. You don't care about them. It is a form of argumentum ad hominem to shift the discussion away from the facts and what kind of a framework should we use to interpret the facts in favor of attacking the credibility of someone to have a valid opinion. I wish that only complete strangers who don't know you any better were the ones engaging in this. But oftentimes it is friends and family. I have a number of friends and family members, especially family members, who have bought into this. And they promote the likes of Tim Keller, who is, if you read up on this, he is a big-time social justice movement proponent. I listened to a sermon that one of my cousins shared a number of years ago in which he was waxing eloquent about collective guilt and how white America, if they don't stand right alongside black American brothers and sisters and support social justice, then they are unbiblical. And then you go and you delve a little bit deeper into this co-founder of the Gospel Coalition's influences, the people he cites as having helped him to form his opinions and his views on race and on the American political tradition and on history, on economics, on justice. And they are Marxists, people. But when I tried to ask questions about this and counter his assertions and talk with my cousin, who's a dear, sweet young lady that otherwise I've always gotten along with great, when I tried to do that, I was told, you know what, I'm not going to have this discussion with you. Thank you for commenting. We're done. Another close relative, we got in a very long, heated discussion where I was told that I don't have enough black friends. He has had many black friends and people within his family that have had racist treatment from white Americans, from police, and that I'm being flippant, I'm being dismissive if I say that there is no such thing as systemic racism, or that you need to make your case, you need to prove that. Well, you know, you just haven't had enough experience to be able to talk about this. Okay, well, you made the claim. How about you support it? How about the burden of proof is on you to prove that there is this thing called systemic racism and that we need to do what you're suggesting we need to do about it. The personal experience I do have is that I am not ugly towards black people. I am not trying to hurt black people. I am not trying to go out and carry out some modern day lynching against black people. But that isn't what's being discussed. What's being discussed is the system. If you question the narrative, it very quickly becomes an ad hominem situation where you're having to defend your character, you're having to defend your motives, you're having to defend and justify your connections, your relationships. Are they diverse enough? Are your experiences diverse enough? If the racism and the bias on the part of the American system today is as systemically prejudiced against black people as is being alleged, it should be easy to prove. And it should not be the case that these protests and now riots and looting kickstart anytime a black person is killed by a cop, anytime a black person is killed by a white person in this country. Before the facts are in, before due process has been carried out, it should not be the case that people have to refer back to Emmett Till as if that happened just yesterday, as if we are in the same place that we were in 1960s Deep South United States of America, 1950s. It should not be the case that slavery is brought up as if that is still going on and we haven't advanced past that. Emancipation didn't happen. The Civil War didn't happen. Integration didn't happen. The Civil Rights Movement didn't happen. But when the BET founder makes headlines saying he wants $14.3 trillion in reparations for black people in America, is that what it's about? Does that solve the problem? What if 14.3 trillion isn't enough? What if the assumptions that this all comes down to dollars and cents first, and then character second, and that character is downstream of financial wherewithal? What if those assumptions are faulty? What if we're being prevented from having honest discussions about these things because to do so would jeopardize the perceived virtue of those who advocate these positions, their reputation, their standing in society with their fellow activists? And what if in preventing an honest discussion about these things, we are guaranteeing the unraveling at the seams of our society? We are guaranteeing greater strife, greater violence, greater animus between people of different races. What if in talking about only the part that white America has to play in all of this, we are missing the responsibility that the black community has for its own culture? I was told when I asked, what is the solution? What is the end goal, ultimately, as you see it, to a number of my friends who are teachers who jumped in on the Black Lives Matter bandwagon early on? One of the things I was told was body cameras. I don't have a problem with body cameras for law enforcement. Have law enforcement wear body cameras. That keeps everybody safe. And you know what would be great is if all of a sudden law enforcement starts wearing body cameras and you have allegations of racial prejudice and mistreatment and abuse of power and excessive force, and then you go back and you roll the tape, and lo and behold, the cop did everything exactly as they should have. All of a sudden, that cop has some protection. Their life is not getting completely ruined and trashed. They're not despairing of being in law enforcement and being a public servant and trying to keep America's streets and neighborhoods safe. I think that's a good thing. And for the bad cops, there's body cam footage. It's got to be played in court. It's got to be admitted as evidence, a primary source of evidence. And the bad cops all of a sudden realize, hey, you know what? I'm not going to just get away with whatever. And they find a new line of work. Or they straighten up and fly right. I think body cameras are a great idea. I don't think that I need to support Black Lives Matter as an organization that is pushing for radical Marxist change in America in order to agree with the idea of body cameras for law enforcement. In fact, I'm certain I don't. I don't have to support Black Lives Matter just because I'm against racism. I don't have to support Black Lives Matter in order to prove that I'm not a racist. Another prominent example from this past week was my wife. And my wife, she sews. She's got her own sewing business. And she makes beautiful clothing for kids and sometimes for herself, for our kids, for other people's kids, as she has time, as she finds time, when she's not juggling taking care of and homeschooling 7 kids and putting up with me. She is part of several fabrics and patterns groups, sewing groups on Facebook. And this past week I'm at work and she calls, or I call her and she's messaging me and I'm messaging back and forth with her. And on each of these 3 or 4 groups, you had people coming in and asking, do you support Black Lives Matter? In each of these groups, the rules of the group are no political discussions, no religious discussions. We are here to talk about sewing. We are here to talk about patterns. We are here to talk about fabric. We are here to talk about the subject that this group is about, which is sewing. And in each of these groups, or I should say in a couple of these groups, the first attempt on the part of the administrator or moderator of the group was to say, that's not what we're talking about here. That, you know what, those are great discussions to have. They don't need to be had here. This is what this group is about. Please follow the rules. In each of those instances where the moderator pushed back, the response was, how dare you? How dare you not support black people in America? That's offensive. And in each of those cases, the end result was that the moderator backed off. I'm sorry, I apologize. I'm not trying to be offensive, and just these are the rules. And how dare you? How dare you? And Tom Wolfe's got a great book that I read a number of years ago, Radical Chic. He's got another great book, Mowing the Flag Catchers. They're two distinct books. I got them as kind of a package deal audiobook. But he talks about how during the 1960s, it was very much in vogue for the wealthiest members of New York high society to invite the Black Panthers to their fancy dress parties, and for movie stars and wealthy people to be fashionable by embracing the narrative of Black Panthers. It made them edgy, it made them dangerous, it made them countercultural, it made them hip. And it became this thing where you would just invite the Black Panthers in, and they would sit down and they would insult you, and they would insult your guests, and they would insult the food, and they would insult everything, and wax eloquent about Black oppression and Black militantism. And these rich white people thought this was great. They thought, oh, hey, fantastic. Look how brave we are. It was also very much a fact that the community organizers, the Black Panthers, they would storm into the offices of government officials and angrily yell at and curse at people who were otherwise just minding their own business. How dare you, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And if there was any pushback, how dare you speak to me that way? You shut up and you sit down and you listen. When I am presumed guilty until I prove my innocence of being a racist, of being a bigot, of being a homophobe, of being a misogynist, of being hateful towards anybody that I disagree with, when accusations are leveled and their truth and validity assumed, until I take my precious time, my precious limited energy, and dispel them, a certain fatigue sets in at a point where you realize no amount of arguing is going to matter, because the truth of your character was not the important thing to begin with. You weren't accused of those things because these people thought that you really were them. You were accused of these things as a way of punishing you for disagreeing. You were accused of these things as a way of silencing you, as a way of marginalizing your position, so that your questions didn't have to be answered. Your position didn't have to be given any attention. Your points didn't have to be considered. The people who are throwing these accusations around are, at best, useful idiots. That's the best thing that you can say about them. They have been duped, and they are tools. They are being used, and they don't even realize how helplessly they have been manipulated to serve as pawns for a larger and very sinister agenda. At worst, this is a extremely amoral, godless, and vicious attack on the reputations, on the credibility, on the standing, on the authority of anyone who might protect our country and our people and our way of life from being destroyed. Far too many know the truth. They know the good that they ought to do, and they are afraid to do it. They're afraid of losing their business. They're afraid of losing their job. They're afraid of losing their prospects of ever being able to find a husband or wife. That was another example I wanted to bring in here, which is I have family who are single and who tell me, I don't know that I'm going to be able to find a spouse in this environment, in my generation, who will give me the time of day because these are the things that I believe. And so rather than continuing to say, this is what I think, this is what's true, and there is a distinction, right? Not everything that we think is true just because we might be conservative, just because we know some things are true, doesn't mean that everything that we believe and everything we hold is true. But we can discuss that, right? That's part of the way that you figure it out, is not by being shouted down or shouting somebody else down with all of these epithets and character assassination attempts. But you figure out what's true and what isn't through testing arguments, testing whether the claims hold water. Put them out there. Let's see. Let's check it. Let's examine it. Let's question it. Let's be rational. Let's be reasonable. And instead, they hide what they think. I have family, I have friends who are young single guys, and they say, I'm concerned that I'm not going to be able to find a woman to marry who is going to tolerate the fact that I believe these things are right. I believe these things are true in today's America. And so what is happening is those young men who are conservative, who hold these ideals, are just acting like chameleons because they desperately don't want to be alone. And a certain rigid conformity is being imposed on them of thought. If they want to have relationships with their friends, if they want to have any kind of a romantic life, if they want to have a career, they had better, sure as hell, not believe these things, say these things, no matter how reasonable the position is. If it is not politically correct, if the wind blew this direction and all of a sudden that's out of fashion to think and say, you better not be caught saying it. Or you're canceled. You're over. You're done. You're finished. You're through. And the sad thing is, if you try to save yourself by apologizing for things that you're not guilty of, and you know you're not guilty of it, and I know that you're not guilty of it, just to appease the mob, just to get them off your back while you try and figure out what to do, it is like chum in the water for sharks. They're not satisfied. Nothing short of complete domination will satisfy them. It is about control. It is about conformity. It is not about the truth. The truth is not a value on the left. Dennis Prager has it exactly right. It would be wise, I would say, for all of you to look up Neil Postman's 1985 book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. And what he talks about is, he says that early America was a literate society. We read books, we read magazines, we were very well read. And in books and magazines of that time, the assumption was that you had to make your arguments, you had to make your case, you had to prove what it was that you were saying. You couldn't just play a 30-second soundbite taken out of context. You couldn't just play a 30-second video clip and portray it however you liked it and spun it. You couldn't do that. You couldn't get somebody elected with the right makeup artist and the right cameraman and the right producer and the right sound and light crew. You had to make your case. And early Americans, up until the advent of the radio and television and pictures, where we all think in pictures now, and we all think in 30-second sound bites. Up until that became the case, it was presumed that Americans needed to be persuaded, and that you needed to make a sound argument, and that your claims were going to be critically examined. And with the advent of radio and with the advent of the television, and as life got faster paced, people got more addicted to just entertaining themselves all the time, that went by the wayside. And now here we are. And somebody watches a 8-second clip, a 30-second clip, and they think they know what happened. And they are at their keyboard in a tizzy right now. They and millions of others of their generation, to destroy this person. They don't know him. That's not due process. They don't know what happened. They don't. Due process is important. The presumption of innocence until guilt is established is important. Objective truth is important, is critical. People say, no justice, no peace. Well, guess what comes before justice? Truth. If you don't have truth, you're not going to have justice. And if we live in a society where truth is subjective, it is whatever you feel like, it is whatever you want it to be, it is whatever you get it into your head, whatever you self-identify it as, then there will not be any justice. Everyone will do what is right in their own eyes, and we are going to tear each other limb from limb. And if you cancel the police, and if you cancel the president, and if you cancel America, we are going to have the state of nature. We will have people tearing each other piece by piece, limb from limb. If you think there's a war on women right now, and you think there's rape culture right now, you just wait. If you think there is injustice against people of certain skin colors or other arbitrary distinctions, that they are mistreated, that they are excluded, just wait. Just wait until you've torn America to pieces and there is just anarchy in its wake, or there's some socialist state where some pious-sounding know-nothing airhead at the top is going to promise you the world, and they don't even know what 2 + 2 is. They think it's 5. Just wait. Anyway, with that, I would encourage you, please, 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 engage in public discourse. Don't despair. Don't give up. Don't surrender. We can do better than this. I'm not trying to be a nuisance. I just think that we can do better than this. In the wise words of Reliant K. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for tuning in. If you disagree, if you agree, if you have something to add, by all means, leave it in the comments. Feel free to email me at garrettmullet@gmail.com, GarrettMullet@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Pinterest, you name it, just about. I'm not on Snapchat. I think Snapchat's weird. That was before my time. But anyway, thank you for watching. Be well. Hit the subscribe button, and God bless.